I've chosen to analyze the article called "Why are the English being hooligans again?" Um, yeah, and well, the text is an article written by Tunku Varadarajan, who is a British writer and journalist and a contributing editor at Politico, where this article is written. Politico is an American political newspaper, and when written in a political newspaper, the article gets a more serious tone. The text is headed towards England, hooligans, and just in general people with interests in hooliganism. And the text is also written in connection to the Euro Cup in 2016, so that makes the topic of hooliganism very relevant. And the fact that the text is written in an online newspaper gives it a bigger audience and makes it possible for people from different countries to read it, which matches the subject of hooliganism and the Euro Cup because it affects and involves many people. And the article thematizes the return of the English hooligans, which has been the case with the Euro Cup in France. Where the narrator takes the starting point in the trouble the hooligans had caused in Marseille, leading up to their game against Russia. The writer then reflects over the reason of the sudden return of the English hooliganism, where he argues that political forces has caused the return of the English hooligans. And the article is divided in an introduction, where the writer describes the hooliganism in general, with focus on the 1980s, and in the middle of the article, the writer analyzes the subject, and at last there's a conclusion. And for his argumentation, he includes different perspectives and specialists to give their opinion, which he then uses to create his own picture of the situation. And here I have an example of that from the article. I sounded out two friends of mine who are astute observers of the English condition, one a distinguished novelist, the other a much lauded Queen's Counsel. And this is an example of how he uses other people's perspective to form his own argumentation. And throughout the article, the narrator generally maintains an objective view on the subject of hooliganism, and he explains the history of hooliganism in the start of the article. And when it comes to his analysis of their behavior and return in France, he uses others' perspective to form a picture of the hooligans, while maintaining a neutral point of view. And the objectivity and inclusion of specialists and others' opinions gives the article ethos because it becomes more trustworthy. However, the author also managed to give his own opinion at the end of the article, where he says that Brexit and Europe has something to do with the return of the hooliganism, the English hooliganism, and the addition of subjectivity gives the article pathos, because it appeals to the audience emotions when he includes his own opinion on the case. And in terms of language use, the narrator keeps a very formal language which fits the subject, and also the political paper it's written in. But there is one place in the article which stands out compared to the rest of the text, and here I found that example from the article. The tabloids, the reading staple, apart from porn and comic books, for the average English yob, have stoked a resurgence of ill will toward the foreigner. And as mentioned, the text is generally written in a formal language, but by including the phrase apart from porn and comic books, the writer adds a humorous dimension to the text by interposing porn and comic books as a part of the average English yob, which I think affects the otherwise serious tone of the argumentation in the article. Yeah, and the first path and introduction of the text gives a very well described picture of the old hooliganism back in the 1980s and their behavior. And the narrator uses figurative language in this path of the article. For example, the metaphor he consumed oceans of beer, which contributes to an interesting introduction of the article. And besides that, the writer also uses other kinds of figurative language throughout the article, like rhetorical questions, for example, where I found an example of that in the article, which says, "So what was it that brought out their atavistic habits?" And the writer also uses a lot of adjectives in the article. For example, in this sentence, the English had rampaged through Marseille for 2 whole days before they encountered any Russians, and 2 days of rampage is a very long time. And the writer has emphasized this by the addition of whole in the sentence, the word whole, the adjective whole, which gives the reader a better insight in the hooligan event in Marseille and for how long it took place. And the use of adjectives in the article makes it more interesting to read and less monotonic. And besides that, the narrator also uses a couple of negative words like ignominious, hated, smashing, threat, and mayhem, which entails that hooliganism is something negative. Then I have chosen to relate the text with another article called "The Hooligan Problem and Football Violence That Just Won't Go Away", because both texts share a negative angle on the hooliganism, and just by looking at the headline of the two articles you can see the resemblance, where the first one is called "The Hooligan Problem and Football Violence That Just Won't Go Away", and the second is called "Why Are the English Being Hooligans Again?". So both headlines says something about the fact that the hooliganism still are among us, where the first says that the hooliganism won't go away, and the second says something about the hooliganism being back and the return of the hooliganism. And one of the focus points from this article is that is the national feeling of being a supportive hooligan, but also the hatred to the foreigners. And I have found an example of that hatred in this article. The supporters did not like the stranger, but Ford explained the foreigner was the one they really hated. And as mentioned, the article focuses a lot on the hooligans' hatred to strangers and externals, which is also seen in other texts, like how football explains the sentimental hooligan, where I have found another example from that text, which says Alan and his friends fumed over this presence of so many outsiders. They decided that they would pay a surprise visit to the North Stand and teach Burnley a lesson about the etiquette of visiting Chelsea. And the phrase from the novella, this is a novella, is an example of another example of the hatred of the foreigner, which, as mentioned, is one of the main focus points in "Why Are the English Being Hooligans Again" article. And then I believe that there is a connection between the introduction and the conclusion of the article, because in the introduction the writer describes the Irish hooligan from the 1980s, and in the conclusion the writer describes the Irish hooligan from the present. And I believe that the writer has chosen to link the introduction and conclusion in this way to show that, like, the English are being hooligans again, and they're acting just like they did back in the 1980s. And the overall picture of the article is that it seems very reliable and very reliable and true to the subject, because of because of where it's written, and also because of how it's written. The narrator's argumentation is very good and well documented, and he gains both ethos and pathos. And besides that, the text is written in a formal and well formulated language.